Grimm is a manufacturer of audio equipment that takes a somewhat different path than normal. Elko Grimm, the CEO, is a fascinating person if you like audio tech because he comes at many problems from a systems perspective, integrating knowledge of the influence of the recording process, acoustics, ear and brain on the sound, as well as a deep understanding of electronics and speakers. I found some correlation between this broader perspective and the ability of resulting equipment designs to address important problems, so I was excited to test Grimm's Streamer DAC, the MU2. Let's see how it performs. The MU2 is priced at $20,600 in the US. From some perspectives, that's expensive. From others, it's a bargain. Let's explore the bargain idea just for a second, although we really need to go over sound quality to discuss this with full intelligence. But to start, to use a modern DAC, you'll probably need a streamer. It's true that you can use a CD drive as a source, and if that's your preference, the integration of a streamer in the MU2 may simply increase the price without any immediate benefit. But if you want to access high-resolution files, and if you want access to the vast and interesting array of new music, including remasters of older recordings, well, you probably want to stream. Buying the files and storing them locally is an option, but it's got its own costly economics. If you like to add to your library frequently, streaming is also the low-cost method of doing so. The point here is that streamers make a difference in sound quality and are not free up front. Assuming the streamer is roughly half the cost of the total package here means that you're getting roughly an $8,000 streamer and a $12,000 DAC or some other combination of numbers that adds up to around $20K. The MU2 also allows volume control, so if streamed digital is your only source, you don't need a preamp, which adds to the on-paper savings. In a world of $20,000 and $30,000 streamers, along with $30,000 and $50,000 DACs and similarly priced preamps, the MU2 is far from the high price spread. Grimm has also certified the MU2 to be a Roon endpoint, a feature not always available in the high end. All that is nice, but we still need to address sound quality. As a preview, the MU2 performs impressively, although as always we need to detail that so you can decide if its strengths and weaknesses will work for you. Okay, what is the issue when we're reviewing DACs? I mean, why do we want to talk at all about high-end DACs? An important reminder, or maybe new information, is that very important sonic factors in music reproduction often involve the 7 major issues of audio believability. As we've outlined them, the big 7 are the problem of recording standards, the problem of visual images, the problem of spatial imaging, the problem of listening in groups, the problem of bass in real rooms, the problem of dynamics, and the problem of amusical digital distortions. The latter is the focus of our DAC series, of which this review is a part. Because DAC distortions are a difficult issue, they tend to get less attention than amplifier circuit and speaker refinements, but these digital issues are probably more important for making progress toward believability at this stage in the evolution of audio technology, which is why we've drawn attention to them. DAC distortions are subtle in an unusual sense. They may involve issues in the time domain rather than the frequency domain, and many listeners are more accustomed to listening for frequency domain issues. But I'll assert that experienced listeners notice time domain problems. They're simply harder to describe. This form of subtlety could be due to awareness. You don't consciously notice what you aren't looking for. I simply assert that you do notice these errors and they relate to musical involvement. You just don't know explicitly why, just like I can't tell you why some sushi or some steak is better than other sushi or other steak, and yet I know it's better. It tastes better, but beyond that, I'm at a loss, which amounts to a so what, because I don't need to explain the difference. I just need to know about it. Then, to add to the challenge, streamers and DACs may also have large-scale distortions that are only triggered by certain signals. That means their subtlety is because they're occasional, not because the resulting distortions are small. When these distortions occur, they're fundamental distractions away from believability, if you know what real instruments sound like. And in some ways, being occasional makes them more noticeable because it isn't as easy to develop a mental filter to disregard them. Neural adaptation and contrast enhancement in the brain support this observation. But the big point is that unusual and unnatural sounds are distractions because they focus attention on the distortion and away from the music. I assert this is bad. An example of a special digital distortion is something called aliasing difference errors. High-frequency sounds can generate a digital artifact called an alias, which is a tone not present in the original signal that's created when the sampling frequency is lower than needed to capture the musical signal. Filtering is used to reduce these artifacts, but certain nonlinearities in the process can lead to very high-frequency alias signals being subtracted from one another, and this generates tones that are shifted into the upper mid-range, like around 3 to 4 kilohertz, where they're easily heard. And as a reminder, they're signals unlike what was in the original music. There are more such digital distortions. Now, I'm not an expert on digital processing, and I'm not trying to turn you into one. I'm simply trying to point out some of the myriad ways that musical digital processing is not just ones and zeros. Timing of data and artifacts from conversion between analog and digital domains are factors that matter for music signals and don't matter for spreadsheets. To put this in musical terms, many recordings heard today on digital have easily heard distortions if you're familiar with the sound of real instruments. Perhaps the best examples of this are the sounds of cymbals. At the extreme, if a cymbal transient were a perfect impulse response, it would contain frequencies up to infinity hertz. A cymbal strike isn't a perfect impulse, but its transient nature yields signals at very high frequencies. It's possible that these are above the frequency or near the frequency manageable by the sampling rate on a specific DAC, and thus are subject to special digital distortions as previously described. It doesn't take long to find transients on a lot of digital playback equipment that sound odd or unnatural. Sometimes this is a function of the overall naturalness of character, and it's with specific instruments like cymbals, but also voice and piano and some winds instruments. I listen to about 250 audio systems per year, and a common pattern I notice is that vinyl source systems rarely have this specific unnatural characteristic and these unnatural sonic events. The point isn't that vinyl is better, because vinyl has its own distinctive distortions and probably more of them, but that vinyl can reveal digital distortions that we're talking about in an easy-to-hear way. Okay, let's talk about sound quality. With that preamble in mind, we'll get to the Grimm MU2. I'll use our standard variables for DAC sound quality, which are a bit different than what you may be used to for amplifiers and speakers. First, overall balance. That is one we normally talk about. You wouldn't think frequency balance would be a big differentiator between DACs, but it's proving to be a factor, which is why we listen and observe. Of course, frequency balance isn't always a byproduct of linear frequency shaping, because most DACs will measure ruler flat in terms of frequency response. But some sense of frequency balance can also have to do with components like high-frequency distortion and transient handling. Since I'm not trying to explain why things happen, but rather what happens sonically with a piece of equipment, my limited understanding of the underlying mechanisms is really irrelevant. I suggest you don't need to understand either, and having read many digital processing research papers, I suggest most people viewing this won't be able to figure it out. I'm not clear that most designers have figured it out completely, and the good ones will acknowledge this. If that's the case, what are your chances? Anyway, philosophical considerations aside, the MU2 seems to have a slightly diminishing treble output as the music extends from the upper mid-range into the treble. This apparent frequency response is a small but meaningful effect. A key point here is that you could argue that most DACs actually have a slightly rising treble output as frequency goes up, and that the MU2 is perfectly flat. This would make sense if the MU2 has lower treble distortion. Some DACs would be brighter than flat because of added distortions. I'm not here to tell you what your preferences are. See our methodology first principles in the description for more. I'm here to explain what products do. But I will say that many audiophiles say that they're fighting an ongoing battle with treble brightness and harshness. The MU2 excels at not overemphasizing treble without sounding dead or lifeless either, assuming the rest of your equipment isn't anti-synergistically tone-shaped. This seems like it could be a prime attraction of the MU2. Now, we should also say that the MU2 seems to have a slightly diminished bass response, or as discussed above, the MU2 might have flat bass, it certainly measures flat, and other DACs have a mild, mid, or low bass bump. Again, this bump is not in the measured response to sine wave input. This is a small difference, but one you will hear with careful listening. If you're fighting room modes or slightly thick bass from your speakers, the MU2 could be what you're looking for. The lower distortion of the MU2 in this case may be lower timing error, for example. And if you're one of the roughly 1/3 of listeners that prefer a leaner or tighter bass balance, the MU2 should be on your short list. For context, you can't really solve speaker and room problems with electronics, but naturally if your system is close to right but needs a little help, you'll look to provide it rather than having to start all over again. The other bit of context I should offer is that I tested the MU2 with my current reference gear, because we always try to limit variables when we're testing something. That means Magico speakers, Block Class A amplification, Wire World cables, and Ready Acoustics room treatment. A less resolving system might not show these frequency balance features to the same degree, which really was pretty small anyway, hypothetically. It might also make the posited low distortion of the MU2 more obvious. I did direct comparisons with a Berkeley Audio Alpha Reference Series 3P DAC and an Orinder N20 Streamer to be sure I was describing differences in the Streamer DAC part of the chain. Okay, the next factor up is treble transient unpacking. Now, if you followed my technical mini treatise, you'll know that DAC treble distortion is often an issue. When DACs do treble well, we get something called treble transient unpacking. What is treble transient unpacking? Well, let's start with the distortion you often hear with digital playback. On cymbals, for example, you'll often hear something that sounds like a crash, even when you doubt that the cymbal is of that type or has been struck with big force. If you listen carefully, you'll notice that even these crashes don't sound right. They come across as more like a burst of noise than a big cymbal hit. It sounds to me as if all the transients of the strike got jumbled in time, leading to something less like real instrumental output and more like unnatural noise. The MU2 unpacks what was previously a kind of noise burst. It becomes a transient followed by ringing and shimmer. The transient isn't overspiked and the decay is spread out like the real thing. The transient is often followed by notable tones and waves of tones and different types of tones, not by grit, undifferentiated except by level. Now, to put this in context, the MU2 is not the best I've heard at treble transient unpacking, but it appears that you often have to pay more to get better overall results. And very importantly, I think the mix of the MU2's well-judged apparent frequency balance and its treble unpacking could easily make it a winner for those who are especially bothered by these treble distortions. Note that some of these distortions are in the recording and not the fault of the D to A process. I test with a number of such recordings, and I found that the MU2 helped ameliorate the recorded problems. It didn't reduce them to zero, but it helped. If you're a fan of 80s and 90s rock and pop and classical, you may want to take special note of this feature. All right, next up, we have soundstage width and depth. Soundstaging on the MU2 is good. To put this in context, I'd say that the soundstage width with the MU2 was perhaps 10% bigger than very good chip-based DACs. At the same time, DACs at 2x or 3x the price have a little bit more soundstage continuity, which means a more natural and fine-grained performer placement. This is subtle. Sound space rendition, which depends on very good reproduction of small signals, is very good with the MU2. This is an area where the high price spread excels, but you should remember that this is somewhat dependent on room acoustics, so you can only go so far with electronics. In any event, the MU2 is supportive of your efforts here. Our next quality is organicness. My final parameter for DAC evaluation is called organicness, which I know is a slightly weird term. There's a lot of research in A to D and D to A conversion suggesting that timing errors, and not just jitter, but also interpolation errors, are a factor in perceived sound quality. I've spent some time listening to time-corrected versus standard conversion techniques in an effort to explain what work on this dimension sounds like. I've landed on the term organicness mainly to indicate that time-managed digital signals and digital conversions sound more natural and relaxed and whole, yielding detail without edginess. Add to that the idea that instruments sound right, not processed. If your reference is the absolute sound, and if you have experience with real instruments, you can notice this right away. It's a bit hard to separate this quality from the tonal balance that I discussed at first, but I think many listeners will find the MU2 to be especially natural and relaxed sounding. Again, I should point out that not all listeners respond to this naturalness in the same way. I'm arguing here that naturalness is a form of lower distortion, but that doesn't mean that the emphasized transients or colorations of the signal that you get when you don't have it aren't something that some listeners would prefer, especially if their reference is the sound of audio equipment, not the sound of real instruments. I think the MU2 is better at organicness than many other DACs. It probably gives up a tiny bit to DACs at 1.5 to 2 times the price here, but not to all of them being better than many. This is a factor you may or may not be sensitive to, but many music lovers will notice this more than the analytical or easy to listen through items like frequency balance. With this in mind, I think a key to the sense of organicness from the MU2 is that its errors, if they even are errors of omission. Errors of commission, in contrast, tend to be more distracting. Now, a subjective coda. Some viewers have struggled a bit with all of this objective, somewhat analytical detail. Admittedly, to make sense of this, you'll want to have some experience with real music and some experience with what it means to have or not have certain characteristics. I might say that's life in a complex technological universe. You can't demand objective information and then balk when you get it. Still, I can see that some people want something different or additional. With the caveat that this is necessarily subjective, not objective, which is what we normally try to do, I'll say that I felt the Grimm MU2 represented the lowest price streamer DAC combination I've heard that's musically satisfying just about across all music. I could nitpick the MU2, as with just about any equipment, but as far as musical values go, this one is a winner. Not the best, maybe, though not clearly not the best. And you have to ask if having the best beyond the MU2 is actually the best use of funds in your system at your budget. All right. Let's briefly discuss the design. The MU2 is nicely compact. It comes with detailed instructions online, something that not every product at this level offers. Beyond that, just a few comments. The user interface is also operated by a giant scroll wheel on top of the product. This can be a useful means of adjusting volume as well if you find yourself standing and walking about during listening. But for the operational UI, I found the wheel to be slightly clumsy, although preferable to tiny buttons. Of course, this is somewhat minor in that it's really mostly a setup thing other than the volume control part. The other UI issue is that the on-screen fonts are smallish. I thought they were fine, given that Rune on a tablet supplies the main data you need while listening. But I know some listeners like fancy readable info on the other side of the listening room. A remote with physical volume control is available. For DAC products with a built-in volume control, I consider this essential for use without a preamp. This message has not been received by many companies who apparently think app-based on-screen sliders have sufficient haptic resolution. No. Rather, this is motivated reasoning for companies trying to save engineering time and cost. Thankfully, Grimm has bypassed this issue. I consider this a very important point since adjusting volume is a frequent operation during real listening. All right. Let's summarize. The Grimm MU2 is an excellent streamer DAC. It helped me understand the enthusiasm in some circles for this design. It excels at this price point with the underappreciated issue of DAC treble hash. It combines this with a natural sound profile that will support the music beautifully in many systems. That's a rare and valuable combination of sonic attributes. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Grimm MU2 Streamer DAC. We invite you to subscribe to our newsletter for other reviews that we publish weekly. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.